The distress beacon came in at 0347 station time, and the sound of it cut through the quiet of the watchroom like a blade through paper. I had been staring at the scanner display for 4 hours, watching nothing move. That was the job at Kepler 7 Frontier Station. You watched. You logged. You drank bad coffee from a machine that had been broken since before I arrived and somehow still produced something warm enough to keep you awake. Nothing ever happened on the outer edge of mapped human space. Nothing ever happened until it did. The beacon frequency was child band encoding. I had never heard it in the field before. I had only heard it in training, in a simulation room on Earth where the instructor had said, very flatly, that this frequency existed because someone, somewhere, had decided that children needed their own signal. A signal even a half-damaged receiver could detect. A signal that cut through interference and solar noise, and the static of deep space like it was designed to be impossible to ignore. It was impossible to ignore. I pulled on my headset and opened the channel, and the first thing I heard was breathing. Small, unsteady breathing. Then a voice, "Hello? Is someone there? My name is Fen. I am 7 years old. The lights went out and I cannot find Mrs. Okafor. The door is stuck. Is someone coming?" I sat very still for 1 full second. Then I started moving. "My name is Mara Voss. I have been a staff sergeant in the United Earth Space Force for 11 years. I have done 2 tours on the frontier, 1 deep-range survey assignment near the edge of the Keth boundary, and 18 months of nothing in particular at Kepler 7, which sits at the far rim of human-charted space like a comma at the end of a sentence nobody finished. I am not a hero. I am not a legend. I am a person who shows up on time and does the job in front of her. And on that morning, the job in front of me was a 7-year-old named Fen, alone in the dark, asking if someone was coming. "Fen," I said, keeping my voice steady the way you learn to do when nothing about the situation is steady. "My name is Mara. I can hear you. I am coming. Can you tell me what you see around you?" There was a pause. I was already running the beacon trace, pulling coordinates, flagging the signal for emergency relay to Earth Command, and logging the origin point all at the same time. The location resolved in 12 seconds. It was a habitat module, designation HR7 Outlier, registered as a civilian science and educational station, small, lightly crewed. The last logged status report had been filed 40 hours ago. Everything normal. Power stable. Crew of 8 adults. 12 children on an educational exchange program from 3 different Earth schools. The current power reading on the module was near 0. "I see a red light," Fen said. "It is on the wall. Everything else is dark. I can hear something outside, but I do not know what it is." "That is an emergency light," I told her. "It means the station knows you need help and it is doing its job. You are doing your job too by pressing the beacon. You did very well." I heard her breathe out slowly. "Okay," she said. "I had the rescue shuttle prepped in 4 minutes. I had the coordinates locked in 5. I left a full automated distress relay running on all channels, and I launched at 6 minutes and 40 seconds after I first heard Fen's voice, which is the fastest I have ever moved in my life. The flight to HR7 Outlier took 22 minutes. I talked to Fen for every single one of them. She told me about her school on Earth, a small building near the coast of New Zealand where the wind came off the water in the mornings and made the windows rattle. She's told me about her teacher, Mrs. Okafor, who had a laugh that sounded like someone dropping a bag of coins. She told me about the trip to the station, how she had pressed her face to the transport window and watched the stars and thought they looked like salt spilled on a black table. She was very smart. She was very calm, much calmer than I was, and I was the one with the training. When I docked with HR7 Outlier, I understood immediately what had happened, and my chest did something I did not have a name for, something that was cold and heavy at the same time. The station had been hit from the outside, not by debris, not by a spatial anomaly. The damage pattern was deliberate, focused. There was a specific signature in the hull breach, clean lines, cauterized edges, the kind of mark that only a directed energy weapon leaves when it fires at something it does not consider important enough to aim carefully at. Something had fired on this station. Something that had looked at a civilian habitat module with 12 children inside and decided it was in the way. I found Fen in the secondary storage corridor, sitting with her back against the wall beneath the red emergency light, her arms around her knees. She had a small scratch on her forehead, already dried. She looked up at me when I came through the manual hatch and she said, "You are Mara?" "I am Mara," I said. "You came fast," she said. I could not speak for a moment. I picked her up and she let me, and she was so light, the way children always are when you carry them, like they are made of something less dense than the rest of the world. I found 3 other children sheltering in the rear observation room. They were between 6 and 9 years old. 2 of them were crying quietly. One was not crying at all, which worried me more than the crying. I got them all into the rescue shuttle, and I wrapped them in thermal blankets, and I gave them water, and I did not look at my hands while I did it because I did not want them to see that my hands were shaking. Mrs. Okafor and 2 other crew members had survived. They were injured but stable. The other 5 adults on the station had not made it. I did not think about that then. I filed it away in a locked room in my mind, and I focused on the 4 small faces in front of me, and I flew them back to Kepler-7. While I flew, my scanner logged a passing residual energy trail. A ship had been here recently, a large one. The trail signature matched nothing in the human registry. It matched exactly a Varath Dominion patrol cruiser, mid-class, the kind the Varath used for routine sweep operations along their mapped resource lanes. I looked at that signature for a long time. When we landed and the medical team came aboard and took the children, Fen reached back and grabbed my sleeve. "Mara," she said. "I am here," I said. "Is Mrs. Okafor going to be okay?" "Yes," I said. "She is going to be fine." Fen nodded, satisfied, and let the medic lead her away. I went to the communications room. I sat down at the console. I pulled up the Varath Dominion patrol log that the station's automated systems had captured in the seconds before the hit, a partial transmission in high-frequency Varath standard encoding. The station AI had been trying to translate it for the past hour. It finished while I sat there. The translation read, "Warning issued. Obstruction in resource lane Delta 9. Debris cleared. Patrol log updated. Continuing route. Debris cleared." That was what they had written. That was the word they had used for a civilian station with 12 children inside. Debris, as if it were a loose rock, a piece of forgotten equipment, something that had simply been in the way. I sat with that translation for a very long time. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my fist on the console. I did not do any of the things that the movies say people do when they learn something that rewires the inside of their chest. I simply opened a priority channel to Earth Command and I said, very quietly and very clearly, "This is Staff Sergeant Marov at Kepler-7 Frontier Station. I need to file an incident report. Priority absolute. Please confirm receipt." The acknowledgement came back in 11 seconds. I started writing. In the medical bay, down the corridor, I could hear Fen asking a nurse whether the stars were always this close or if Kepler-7 was special. The nurse said she thought Kepler-7 was a little special. Fen said she thought so too. I kept writing. Whatever came next I did not know yet. I only knew that I had heard a 7-year-old's voice in the dark, and I had come, and she was safe. And the people who had made her unsafe had logged it as routine and moved on. They would not be moving on for much longer. I sent the report. I leaned back in my chair. I looked at the stars through the observation port, the same stars Fen had pressed her face against a transport window to see, and I thought, the galaxy is about to learn something new about the people who live here. It was going to be a difficult lesson. But it was going to be learned. There is a specific kind of silence that is not empty. It is the silence of rooms where decisions have already been made, where the conversation happened before you walked in, where everyone seated at the table is no longer asking questions but has moved on to the next thing which is doing. Earth Command went quiet 8 hours after I filed my report, and it was that kind of silence, not quiet like mourning, not quiet like indecision, quiet like a door being shut very carefully from the inside, the latch engaging with a soft, definitive click that you feel more than hear. I noticed it first in the communication logs. Diplomatic frequencies, which had been running at normal traffic levels since the incident, dropped to near zero. Not jammed, not cut, chosen. Human embassies across 12 star systems stopped transmitting their routine updates. The scheduled trade negotiation with the Morale Accord was postponed without explanation. The weekly cultural exchange broadcast to the Keth Consortium, which had run without interruption for 30 years, simply did not go out. The rest of the galaxy interpreted this as grief. That was their mistake. The Varath Dominion released a statement 43 hours after I filed my report. It was addressed to what they called the human collective and classified humanity as a Class 4 developing species, which is the Varath way of saying you are too small to require careful handling. The statement acknowledged that a patrol cruiser had cleared an obstruction in resource lane Delta 9. It expressed what it called regret for any confusion this may have caused among parties unaware of standard Varath patrol procedure. It recommended that humanity register future outpost constructions with the Varath Territorial Survey Office to avoid similar incidents. That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement of the children, no name for what they had done. Just a bureaucratic non-event, stamped and filed, from an empire 400 years old that had never once been made to answer for anything. I read the statement on my console at Kepler-7. I read it twice. Then I walked to the medical bay to check on Fen, who was awake and eating something orange and vaguely fruit-shaped, and telling the duty nurse that the portion sizes in space were not great. She looked up when I came in and said, "Is there news?" "There is always news," I said. "How are you feeling?" "My head hurts a little," she said, touching the small bandage on her forehead. "But the nurse said that is normal. She said it will stop hurting in 2 days." "She is right," I said. Fen looked at me for a moment with the directness that children have, the kind of look that has not yet learned to be polite about what it sees. "You are worried about something," she said. "I am thinking about something," I said. "There is a difference." Fen considered this. "Okay," she said. "Can I have more of this orange thing?" I got her more of the orange thing. I went back to my console. The priority channel from Earth Command had a new message waiting. Flagged eyes only, bearing the classification seal I had never seen outside of textbooks. It was a summons. I was told to report to Orbital Station Meridian in 48 hours. No further explanation was given. No further explanation was needed. When Earth Command sends a summons with that seal, the explanation is already implicit. Something is happening, and they want you in the room where it is happening. I arranged for Fen and the 3 other children to be transferred to a proper medical and care facility on the nearest inhabited station. I arranged for Mrs. Okafor and the 2 surviving crew members to receive full support. I packed a single bag and boarded the first transit vessel to Meridian. On the way, I looked up Orbital Station Meridian in the public directory. It was listed as an administrative coordination hub, which is the kind of description that means something entirely different from what it sounds like. I had heard the name spoken once years ago by a retired fleet officer who had mentioned it the way people mention things they are not supposed to mention, with a very brief pause before and after, as if placing the word in a small box and shutting the lid. When I arrived and cleared the security gates, which were the most thorough I had ever encountered, I was led to a briefing room by a young man named Corporal Owen Davies, who had the kind of practiced blank expression that meant he had already signed 17 different confidentiality agreements and was not going to be caught making small talk about any of this. The briefing room was not large. It did not need to be. There were 11 people seated around the table when I walked in, and I recognized each of them from official broadcasts and public records, and the kind of photographs that appear at major diplomatic events. Admiral Louise Carver, commander of the Outer Fleet, whom I had once seen give a 10-minute speech about frontier preparedness that had made everyone in the room feel like they had been asleep for a decade. Secretary General Alain Bernard, the head of the UN Unified Earth Administration, Director Priya Nair of the Earth Intelligence Service, 7 others whose names I knew from operational briefings, and whose presence here told me, with absolute certainty, that what was happening was not small. Nobody greeted me with warmth, not because they were cold, but because they were past the stage where warmth was relevant. They were in the stage of getting things done. Admiral Carver gestured to the empty chair at the foot of the table. I sat. She said, "You filed the report." You heard the child's voice. "You were the first human on that station after it was hit. That puts you in a specific category for what we are about to tell you." "What category?" I asked. "Witness," she said. "The kind that needs to be present at the beginning and the end, so that when the record is written, there is at least one person in it who was there for all of it." I understood, in a general sense, what she was telling me. I did not yet understand the full scale of it. That came in the next 2 hours as the briefing proceeded, and I sat in my chair and tried not to let my face show everything I was feeling, which was difficult, because what I was feeling was the particular sensation of the ground rearranging itself beneath your feet. What I learned in that room was this. 30 years ago, not long after the first sustained contact with species beyond human space, certain people within Earth's military and strategic planning divisions had made a quiet decision. The decision was based on a simple reading of history, the history of every species humanity had ever encountered, and the history of humanity itself. The decision was that space, like every frontier before it, eventually produced moments when being able to say no was not enough. You needed to be able to mean it. And so, quietly, patiently, without announcement or declaration, Earth had built, not provocatively, not with aggression, but with the long-game understanding of a species that had spent 10,000 years learning what happens when you are unprepared for the worst that other powers can do. The fleet was called the Verdant Array, and it existed in the records under a budget line that read Long-Range Survey and Atmospheric Research Allocation, which was, as Director Nair explained with a perfectly straight face, technically accurate because several of the ships did carry atmospheric sensors. The Verdant Array was not small. I will not name the number of ships or the specifications of their weapons, because even now those details are classified, and also because numbers are not the point. The point is that for 3 decades, while the Varath Dominion looked at humanity and saw a Class 4 developing species still learning how to navigate interstellar space, humanity had been doing something the Varath had not thought to account for in their assessment. Studying. Every war the Varath had ever fought was in Earth's database. Every tactical pattern, every strategic preference, every weakness that had ever been exploited by any opponent over 4 centuries of Varath military history had been analyzed, categorized, cross-referenced, and built into the training programs of a fleet that did not officially exist. The Varath were not a mystery. They were a known quantity. They simply did not know that they were known. The plan, as Admiral Carver explained it, was not revenge. I want to be very clear about this because the word gets used and it is not right. What Earth intended was accountability. There would be one formal demand, transmitted through official galactic diplomatic channels, in accordance with every treaty and protocol humanity had ever signed. The demand had 3 elements: full acknowledgement of what had occurred at HR-7 Outlier, using accurate language and not the word debris; a formal tribunal for the captain of the patrol cruiser, conducted under joint human and galactic law; reparations, to be determined by an independent council. The demand would be sent. A response window of 72 hours would be given. And then, Secretary General Bernard said in the same tone a person uses to describe a weather forecast, if they refuse, the Verdant Array moves. Everyone at the table knew the Varath would refuse. Empires 400 years old do not accept demands from Class 4 developing species. It is not in their operational experience. It is not something they have ever had to learn to do. They were about to learn it. I asked one question. I asked why I was here in this room, rather than being debriefed and sent home. Admiral Carver looked at me for a moment. She said, "Because the record matters. What we are about to do, we are doing for a reason that begins with one specific moment, in one specific corridor, on one specific station. That moment needs a human face attached to it, not just a report number. You are that face, and when it is over, we want someone who was present at both ends of this to be able to say, clearly and honestly, this is why it happened, and this is what it meant." I thought about Fen asking for more of the orange thing. I thought about the translation on my console. Debris cleared. All right, I said. The formal demand was transmitted to the Varath Dominion the following morning. It was precise, measured, and unambiguous. The response arrived in 40 minutes, which was faster than expected, and faster than was wise on their part, because it meant they had not thought carefully about it. They had simply reacted from the confidence of 400 years of being the largest presence in the room. The response was a form letter, a pre-written dismissal template, the kind of document that says, "We have received your communication and considered it, and found it beneath the level of our attention," without quite using those words. It was stamped with the imperial seal. It was addressed to the human collective, Class 4 developing species. It recommended again that humanity register future outpost constructions with the appropriate Varath administrative body. Secretary General Bernard read it at his desk. He folded it once, neatly along the crease. He put it in his desk drawer. He looked at Admiral Carver and he nodded once. That nod lasted less than a second. It was the smallest possible motion. And it was the moment that everything that came after began. I watched it happen and I wrote it down and I thought, you do not send a form letter to the people who built the Verdant Array. You do not stamp a dismissal and consider the matter closed when the matter, as of 40 minutes ago, has only just started. The galaxy was about to discover the distance between assuming something is settled and it actually being settled. It was a significant distance. Admiral Carver stood up, buttoned her jacket, and said very calmly, "Prepare the fleet." The Verdant Array did not announce itself when it launched. There was no broadcast, no declaration, no transmission to the galactic community to say, "Watch this." The fleet simply moved, the way large things move when they have been waiting a long time to do so, with a kind of settled, unhurried certainty that is more unnerving than speed. You expect explosions to be fast. You expect consequences to arrive loud and sudden. The Verdant Array arrived the way a tide arrives, steady and absolute and not particularly interested in what the shore thinks about it. I was aboard the flagship, a vessel called the Yusef Immovable, which I had been told was named not for its size but for its purpose. A name like a promise. I stood on the bridge at the rear observation station, which was where embedded correspondents stood, and I watched the fleet around us through the display panels, and I understood for the first time what 30 years of quiet preparation looks like when it finally unfolds. It looked like purpose. It looked like 1,000 ships moving without wasted motion, each one exactly where it needed to be, each crew doing exactly what they had trained to do, and none of them making more noise about it than necessary. There were no speeches on the day of launch. Commander Harriet Lane, who commanded the immovable and had a voice like gravel and a face that had been in charge of things for a very long time, said 3 sentences on the ship-wide channel before we entered transit. She said, "You know why we are here. You know what we are going to ask for. And you know what we are going to do if the answer is no." That was it. The rest of the galaxy did not know we had launched for 11 hours. When the Verdun Array's entry into Vareth-adjacent space registered on every long-range sensor network from here to the Keth outer boundary, the response in the broader diplomatic community was, as I would later read in the intercept logs, something close to disbelief. The Keth Consortium transmitted a priority message to Earth Command asking whether there had been an error in the sensor data. Earth Command confirmed that there had not been an error. The Morale Accord sent a formal request for parley, which is the polite galactic word for, "Please stop and talk to us before you do whatever you are about to do." Earth Command acknowledged the request and responded that the time for parley was the 72-hour window that had already passed, and that humanity appreciated the concern. The Sinsiks of Vel, an elder civilization that had not entered into a military conflict in 200 years and maintained their position in the galactic community by being exceptionally good at standing between other people and their disputes, transmitted a message to Admiral Carver personally. I was told its contents were very long and very eloquent and amounted to, "We strongly urge restraint." Admiral Carver's response was 3 words. It read, "Noted with respect," and we kept moving. The Vareth Dominion mobilized 4 days after we launched. Their fleet was substantial, the product of 4 centuries of gradual accumulation, heavy ships built for long campaigns, crewed by generations of soldiers who had grown up in a civilization that had never genuinely lost a war. They outnumbered us in ships. They had experience we did not have in years. Their admirals had overseen engagements humanity had only read about in intercepted historical records. The Emperor released a public address to his people and to the broader galactic community. I have the full translation in my records. The part that circulated everywhere, the part that got repeated in every news dispatch and diplomatic cable for the next 3 months, was the final line. He called humanity a brief inconvenience. I was on the bridge of the immovable when that phrase reached us. I looked around at the crew. Nobody laughed. Nobody made a comment. Commander Lane read it on her screen and set the screen down and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "They are going to wish they had not used that word." Then she went back to work. The first engagement was at Vel Crossing, a region of navigable space near the boundary of Vareth-controlled territory, where 3 transit lanes intersected and where the Vareth had stationed a significant defensive presence, the kind of fortified position that it held, in their history, through 11 different attempted incursions by civilizations more established than ours. Their tactical doctrine assumed any attacker would approach along the primary lane and attempt to push through by force. Their defenses were built around that assumption. We did not approach along the primary lane. I am not a military analyst, and I will not pretend to explain every element of what happened at Vel Crossing. What I can tell you is what I saw from the bridge, and what I saw was this. The Vareth defenders responded to a formation that was not where they expected it, moving in a way they had not prepared for, using a sequence of coordinated action that they had no tactical model for, because it had been designed using the detailed study of every weakness every enemy had ever found in Vareth strategy across 400 years of history. The Vareth fought like an empire. They fought according to protocols that had worked before, and would have worked against any opponent who was operating from general principles. We did not fight from general principles. We fought from specific knowledge of this specific enemy, their specific habits, their specific blind spots, the specific assumptions their commanders made under specific kinds of pressure. Vel Crossing held in Vareth history against the most determined incursion they had ever faced. For 6 weeks and 2 days, we moved through it in 6 hours. I sat on the bridge and I watched the displays and I felt something that I did not expect to feel, which was not triumph. It was something quieter. Something that felt, if I am honest, more like grief than celebration. Because what I was watching was not humanity being wonderful. It was humanity having prepared, for 30 years, for the possibility that something like this would happen, and the preparation working, and the reason the preparation was necessary being a 7-year-old in a dark corridor, asking if someone was coming. There is no good version of that. There is only the version where you are ready, and the version where you are not. After Vel crossing, the intercept channels became very busy. Commander Lane showed me one, mid-afternoon of the day after the battle, when the fleet had pushed 40 light minutes deeper into the approach corridor, and the Vareth rear defensive line was still reorganizing from the shock of what had happened to their forward position. It was a message from a Keth observer who had been embedded with the Varath fleet as a neutral recorder, the kind of official witness the elder species sent to all major military engagements to ensure that the galactic historical record was accurate. The message was addressed to the Keth Consortium Senior Council. It read, "I think we have all made a very significant error in our assessment of this species." Commander Lane forwarded it to the ship-wide channel. Every member of the Immovable's crew read it. I watched the bridge officers read it, by one, as the message appeared on their screens. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. A few people exchanged glances. One young navigation officer, a woman named Clara Finch, who had been on her first operational deployment and had barely slept in 2 days, read the message and then looked back at her console and made a small adjustment to the transit calculation she was running. That was all. I wrote it down. I thought, that is the thing. That is the specific thing that makes this what it is. Not the fleet, not the tactics, not the 30 years of preparation. It is that nobody cheered. Because this was never a game. It was never about being impressive. It was about a child who had pressed a beacon in the dark and asked if someone was coming, and it was about making sure that question would never go unanswered. Not here, not anywhere, not for anyone. The campaign continued. The Vrath fell back from 3 more positions in the following 10 days. They adapted, as experienced militaries do. They were not stupid. They were simply operating with incomplete information about what they were facing. And incomplete information, in war, is the same as a hole in the hull. You can try to manage it, but the cold keeps coming in. I recorded everything. I filed daily dispatches to Earth Command. I ate meals in the crew galley with people whose names I was learning, people who had trained for this for years and who carried their purpose with a quietness that I found, over those days, profoundly moving. A chief engineer named Derek Osey, who could fix anything on the ship with what appeared to be sheer stubbornness and a very old set of manual tools. A communications officer named Lily Cross, who could read a signal intercept at half speed while holding 2 other conversations and never lose her place in any of them. A young medic named Sam Hollis, who had decided to record a personal diary every evening, which he read aloud to whoever was in the medical bay, and which was mostly about missing his dog. These were the people in the fleet that was making the galaxy rethink everything it thought it knew about humanity. They were ordinary people. That was the point. They were ordinary people who had been given a reason, and they were doing their jobs. One evening, 12 days into the campaign, I sent a personal recording to Fen, not an official message, not a report, just a brief transmission to a 7-year-old at a care facility on Station Oris 4, who was, according to the updates I had been receiving, doing very well, eating an extraordinary quantity of that orange food, and had recently declared that she wanted to be a navigator when she grew up. I said, "Hello Fen, it is Mara. I hope the orange things are still good. We are handling it. You are safe. Go back to school." I do not know if she heard it right away. I do not know what she made of it. But I sent it because it felt necessary to have her voice somewhere in this, even indirectly. Because the whole shape of what was happening had her at its center. The way the center of a circle is the point everything else is built around, even though the center itself is just a point, quiet and still while the rest of it moves. 2 days later, the Vareth High Command requested an emergency contact with Earth Command. Not a surrender, not yet, just a request for a pause, what they called a tactical reassessment window, which is the phrase militaries use when they need time to understand what is happening to them, without admitting that they do not understand what is happening to them. Earth Command declined. We kept moving. The galaxy watched. The elder species sent more messages. The Syndics of Vel sent another one to Admiral Carver, this one shorter than the first, which said only, "We did not fully understand the situation." Admiral Carver acknowledged it. We kept moving. The Emperor stopped calling us a brief inconvenience. His public addresses stopped mentioning us by name at all, which was its own kind of answer. We were 13 days from the Varath home system, when the situation changed in a way that required the fleet to stop, and to demonstrate something that was, if anything, more significant than everything that had come before. The Emperor made a gambit. He had identified 17 inhabited worlds along our approach corridor, planets with civilian populations that had no military value, and he announced, in a broadcast to the full galactic community, that he had positioned area denial systems around each one. Systems capable of rendering those worlds uninhabitable within 4 hours. If the Verdant array advanced another light year in any direction, he said, the countdown would begin. The fleet stopped. There was silence across every channel for 72 hours. I sat in my quarters on the immovable, and I stared at the wall and I thought about what was on those 17 worlds, millions of lives. People who had nothing to do with what their emperor had done, who had not voted for this gambit, who had simply been born where they were born, and were now being used as a wall between a desperate ruler and the people he had wronged. Admiral Carver came to find me on the morning of the third day. She sat down across from me and she said, "We are going to handle it." I said, "How?" She said, "The contingency." I had heard that word in briefings. I had never heard it explained. I did not ask for an explanation now. I just looked at her, and she looked at me and she said, "Every one of those systems will be addressed simultaneously. There will be no countdown. There will be no danger to those worlds." "How long?" I asked. 30 minutes, she said. I looked at her for a long moment. 30 years of preparation, I said. She said, "We planned for the worst possible version of this. That is the job." 31 minutes later, every area denial system surrounding every one of those 17 worlds went offline simultaneously. Not disabled by external attack, accessed internally. The command codes, the override sequences, the network architecture of every one of those weapons platforms had been mapped, studied and prepared for in advance. Because 30 years of preparation means you do not only think about the battles, you think about the moments when the enemy tries to change the terms. The gambit collapsed. The broadcast went dark. The Emperor, for the first time in what was described to me by a Keth historical advisor as 400 years of recorded Varath imperial communications, went publicly silent for an entire day. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Not the tone of an emperor addressing subjects. Something else. Something that sounded, in the translation, oddly and uncomfortably human. He asked to open a channel to Earth Command. We let him wait 12 hours. Then we opened the channel. And we kept moving. The surrender ceremony happened in a place that nobody had planned, because the Varath requested it on neutral ground, and the only neutral ground available within the relevant region was a mid-size orbital platform, operated by the Keth Consortium, which had recently been retrofitted with a conference facility that still smelled of fresh construction material, and had chairs that were very slightly the wrong height for human anatomy. I sat in those chairs for 4 hours, and I took notes, and I felt the particular sensation of watching something large and old come to a stop. The Varath contingent arrived in formal dress, the kind of layered ceremonial clothing that their culture reserved for occasions of maximum significance. The Emperor did not come himself. He sent his second, a figure called the Sovereign Voice, whose function was to speak for the Emperor in matters too consequential for subordinates, but too dangerous for the Emperor to attend in person. The Sovereign Voice was very old. His name in translation was something close to Aldrich of the Second House, and he carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who is walking through a situation their entire civilization has never walked through before. Admiral Carver led the human delegation. I sat 2 rows back in the observer section. I had my recording equipment and my notebook, which I still preferred to digital logging for moments I wanted to remember accurately. The terms were presented. They were the same 3 elements that had been transmitted before the fleet moved. Acknowledgement, tribunal, reparations. Nothing had been added. Nothing had been removed. We had not, in the weeks since the campaign began, expanded the list. That was deliberate, and it was the thing that seemed to unsettle Aldrich of the Second House more than anything else. He had clearly expected the terms to have grown. He had expected demands for territory, or resources, or formal submission on additional points. Empires that lose expect to lose more than they originally owed. He did not understand yet that we had never wanted more than what we said we wanted. Admiral Carver read the terms aloud. Aldrich of the Second House listened. He asked several questions, each one a careful probe, looking for the hidden cost. Was acknowledgement a precursor to a broader legal action? No, it was acknowledgement. Was the tribunal to be controlled by human authorities? No, it was to be conducted under joint galactic law, with neutral arbiters selected from 3 species, none of which were human. Was the reparations figure predetermined? No. It was to be set by an independent council. He asked, "What do you want from this, beyond what is written?" Admiral Carver said, "What is written is what we want." He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked past her, at the wall of humans behind her, at me in my observer seat, at the rest of the delegation, and I saw something move across his face that I can only describe as a recalibration. The look of a being who had operated on a set of assumptions about what younger species were and what they did and what they wanted, and was now, for the first time, discarding those assumptions in real time. He signed the terms. The Varath Dominion did not fall. This is important. We had not come to end them. We had come to make them answer for what they had done. And they answered, and the Empire continued. Smaller and quieter, and with a great deal less certainty about what it was, and was not permitted to do in the space it moved through. The captain of the patrol cruiser, whose name was Veth Commander Karoth of the 6th Line, was called before a joint tribunal 3 weeks after the signing. I attended the first session. He was a tall figure, broad, with the bearing of someone who had commanded ships for a long time, and was accustomed to being the largest authority in the room. He sat at the tribunal table and he listened to the charges, and he said, in his own defense, that he had followed standard Varath patrol procedure, that the station had been in a designated resource lane, that the warning had been issued. The arbiters asked him how long the warning had been in the air before he fired. 11 seconds. There was silence in the room. The arbiters made a note. The tribunal continued. I filed a dispatch to Earth Command that evening, and then I went to my bunk on the transport vessel that had carried the delegation to the platform, and I lay down, and I thought about 11 seconds. I thought about what 11 seconds means to an automated translation system, trying to decode a high-frequency signal in a language it has only partial mappings for. I thought about a station with 12 children and a skeleton crew, and no military hardware and no reasonable ability to move out of a lane in 11 seconds, even if they had understood perfectly what was being said to them. I thought about Fen, asleep in the corridor, who never heard the warning at all. I did not sleep well that night. I have not slept perfectly well since the morning of the beacon, which I think is appropriate. Some things should stay with you. They should leave a mark. Not to make you bitter, but to keep you honest. To make sure you remember why the thing mattered in the first place. When the paperwork has been filed and the ceremony is over, and the galaxy has moved on to the next thing. The Reparations Council convened 6 weeks after the signing. I was not present for all of it, only the opening session. The figure they eventually agreed upon was substantial. It was to be paid over 2 centuries, which sounds like a long time unless you consider that the Varath Dominion had operated for 400 years, and would likely operate for several centuries more, and that 2 centuries of financial accountability was, relative to that scale, not as long as it sounded. What happened next? I did not plan. I do not know who planned it. I have a suspicion, and the suspicion points to Director Nair at Earth Intelligence, who has a talent for doing meaningful things without announcing that she is doing them. But I have no confirmation. What happened was this. The first disbursement from the Reparations Fund was directed, before any other allocation, to a newly established children's educational endowment, named simply the HR7 Foundation, covering educational resources and travel grants for children from frontier communities across the human-charted region, so that children on small stations and outlier habitats would have access to learning opportunities that did not require them to be in the right place at the right time. No press release was issued, no announcement was made. A Keth cultural observer noticed the record in the public disbursement filing, where it was listed plainly among the standard line items, and sent an inquiry to Earth Command asking whether the allocation was intentional, and not, for example, a filing error. Earth Command confirmed that it was intentional. The observer apparently sat with that for a while, and then forwarded the record to several colleagues, and from there it spread through the diplomatic community the way things spread, when they are small and unexpected and say something about the people involved that no speech or declaration could quite say. I heard about it from Commander Lane, who forwarded me the message chain with no comment attached. I read it and thought about Fen asking for more of the orange food and decided that it felt right. Aldrich II House, in the weeks after the signing, gave several interviews to Galactic correspondents. He was asked, in each of them, some version of the same question: what did you misunderstand about humanity? In the interview that circulated most widely, he was quiet for a moment before answering. Then he said, "We understood your technology level. We understood your territorial spread. We understood your diplomatic posture. What we did not understand was the thing underneath all of it. The reason the technology was built, and the reason the ships moved when they moved. We thought we were dealing with ambition, or pride, or the ordinary strategic interests of a rising species. We were not. We were dealing with something simpler and considerably more difficult to account for. We were dealing with people who meant what they said." That quote ran in 23 languages across the galactic communication networks. Earth Command did not comment on it. They did not need to. On the day the signing ceremony concluded, There was one final exchange that I witnessed and that I have thought about more than any other moment in the whole of those 93 days. The ceremony was ending. The delegations were rising from their chairs. Aldrich of the second house stood and looked across the table at Admiral Carver, and he asked in the quiet of the room, with the recording equipment running and the observers still in their seats. A question that I think he genuinely could not help asking, he said. Why? For one child. Admiral Carver did not answer immediately. She straightened the folder of documents in front of her with one hand, a small, unhurried motion. Then she looked at him. She said, every child. We started with this one. Aldrich of the second house had no answer for that. I watched him not have an answer for it. The way a door swings open, and the person standing in the frame suddenly sees the room beyond it, and understands that the room is much larger than the door suggested. He nodded once, very slowly. Then the ceremony ended, and everyone went out into the corridor, and the officers from 4 different civilizations stood around the refreshment station, drinking whatever it was that Keth had provided, which tasted like warm metal and was apparently considered excellent. And somebody made a quiet remark about the chairs being the wrong height, and everyone who was sitting down agreed. I wrote it all down. I wrote down the chairs. I wrote down the warm metal drink. I wrote down the nod. I wrote it all down because that is what witnesses do, and because someone needed to have all of it in one place, from the beacon to the nod, so that the record would be accurate and complete. I sent my final operational dispatch to Earth Command that evening. In the appendix, as I had promised myself I would, I attached a photograph. It had been sent to me 2 weeks earlier by the care facility on Station Oris 4, along with a brief note that said Fenn was doing very well and had been asking about space navigation programs for younger students. The photograph showed her at a school desk, in a blue jacket, holding up a drawing she had made. The drawing was of a spaceship. It was not a very accurate spaceship by any technical standard. It had the approximate shape of a crayon and what appeared to be at least one extra wing. But it was absolutely recognizable as a spaceship, and she was holding it up and grinning with a gap where a front tooth had recently fallen out. I attached the photograph and labeled it, for the record. Then I closed my dispatch folder and went to the galley for dinner and had a conversation about deep space navigation with a Keth adjunct officer who had very strong opinions about mapping software, and it was a perfectly ordinary evening, which was exactly the right kind of evening to have. I went back. That is the part people seem to find surprising when I tell the story. They expect something else, a promotion, a new assignment, a ceremony somewhere perhaps, a reason to move forward into something larger. But I requested reassignment to Kepler 7 Frontier Station, the same post I had been at before, the same quiet edge of mapped human space, the same broken coffee machine that still produced something warm if you hit the right side of it with the heel of your hand. My commanding officer, a patient man named Colonel Douglas Farr, read my reassignment request twice and then called me into his office and said, with genuine puzzlement, "You want to go back to that station?" "Yes," I said. "Why?" I thought about how to say it. "Because the job needs doing," I said. "And because I know that part of space." He looked at me for a while. Then he approved it. I think he understood, in the way that good officers understand things they do not need to have explained in full, that what I was really saying was, I want to be where it started. I want to be the person who is there, in that quiet sector, when the next beacon comes in. Because there will be a next one. Not necessarily the same kind. Not necessarily for the same reason. But there will always be a next one. And someone needs to be there for it. The galaxy had changed in ways I was still processing as I flew back to Kepler 7 on a routine transport. The elder species had spent the months since the Varath signing in a state of intense and sustained recalibration. The Keth Consortium had revised every assessment document they held on humanity. The Morale Accord had requested, through formal diplomatic channels, a series of in-depth cultural exchange meetings with Earth representatives, and the meetings had been happening, 2 per week, for 3 months. The Syndics of Vel had been the most interesting. They had sent a single transmission to Earth Command that read, "We would like to understand you better." Earth Command had responded, "We would like that too," and had set up an ongoing forum. Nobody was openly afraid of us. That was not how it worked. But something had shifted in the texture of how other species thought about humanity. A recognition that the category they had placed us in, the comfortable box labeled developing, young, not yet fully formed, was not the right category, and perhaps had never been the right category, and that the process of finding the right category was going to require a significant amount of time and quiet, careful rethinking. I did not feel triumphant about this. I want to be honest about that. I felt something more like tired, the specific tiredness that comes not from doing too much, but from caring too much for too long. I felt ready for the quiet of Kepler-7, and the coffee machine, and the long hours of watching nothing in particular move on the scanner. I visited Fen before I shipped out. She was at a school on Station Oris 4 now, a proper one, with a permanent building and teachers who were not dodging sensor failures. In a classroom, with a window that looked out over the station's inner dome where they grew food and there were always lights on. She had been enrolled in an accelerated science track. Her teacher told me, in a brief note before I arrived, that Fen was one of those students who made you feel like you were watching something in the early stages of becoming remarkable. I arrived on a Tuesday. She was eating lunch in the cafeteria when I came in, at a table with 4 other children, in conversation that apparently involved a significant disagreement about whether the largest moon of a particular gas giant in the outer survey region deserved a better name than its current designation, which was a number. She looked up and saw me, and her face did the thing children's faces do, the full and immediate expression of something good happening. And she said, "Mara." I sat down at the table. I had terrible synthetic noodles, which seemed appropriate. The other children looked at me with the frank and total curiosity of their age, and one of them asked me directly, within about 30 seconds, whether I was the person from the news. I said I was not famous and that they should finish their food. After lunch, Fen and I walked around the inner dome for a while. She told me about navigation, which she had begun studying, and about her teacher, who she liked very much and who was strict but fair, which is the best possible combination. She told me about the tooth that had fallen out and the one growing back in to replace it. She told me that her mother and her older brother had come to visit last month, and that it had been good to see them. She did not ask about the fleet or the Vareth or the tribunal. I do not know if she understood the full shape of what had happened, or if she had been told in the careful way you tell children things, with the edges smoothed and the hardest details set aside for later. She was 8 years old. She had her own universe to operate in, one made of school and navigation charts and moons that needed better names and lunches that were not quite good enough. I was glad of it. I was genuinely, completely glad of it. Before I left, she hugged me, the sudden and total hug of someone who has decided on the action and commits to it without reservation. Then she stepped back and looked up at me with the same directness she had shown in the medical bay when she told me I was worried about something. She says, "Will you come back?" "I will come back," I said. "Promise," I said. She nodded, satisfied, and ran back toward the school building, because apparently there was an afternoon class on planetary survey reading that she did not want to miss. I flew to Kepler-7, and I took my post, and I relearned the particular pleasure of a quiet sector and a slow scanner and a warm drink from a machine that should not have been functional but was. Colonel Farr sent me a brief welcome-back message that said simply, "Glad to have you where you need to be." I thought that was exactly right. I had been back for 42 days when the beacon came in. It was a different frequency this time. Not child band. It was a civilian distress signal, the standard kind, coming from a small vessel about 2 light hours from my position. The signal was in Vareth civilian encoding. I want to be honest about the moment when I read that. I want to be honest about the small, complicated thing that happened inside my chest when I identified the encoding, the brief pause, the old weight of everything that word had meant over the past year. Then I ran the trace. The vessel was a small Varath civilian transport. 3 persons aboard according to its automated crew manifest. Engine failure. No weapons, no military affiliation, no threat profile. Just a small ship with people in it who were having a bad day in a remote sector and had pressed a beacon, hoping someone was listening. I started the rescue protocols. I prepped the shuttle. I opened the channel. A voice came back, rough with static, speaking Varath with the accent of the civilian southern regions where they did not drop the hard consonants. The station AI translated in real time. "This is Vareth civilian vessel identification 37 Tela. We have an engine failure. Is anyone receiving? This is Staff Sergeant Mara Voss at Kepler-7 Frontier Station," I said, in the even tone you learn to use when nothing about the situation should be given the chance to be uncertain. "I am receiving you. I am coming. Can you tell me your current status?" There was a silence. Then the voice said, still in translation, "You are human." "I am human," I said. Another silence, shorter this time. Then carefully and with what I thought was genuine effort, "Thank you." I launched at 6 minutes and 30 seconds after the beacon, which is slightly faster than the last time, because I had relearned the launch sequence and knew where every switch was and did not have to think about it. I flew out through the quiet of the sector, the same stars Fen had pressed her face to a window to see, and I thought about what the purpose of all of this actually was. Not the fleet, not the campaign, not even the tribunal and the reparations and the Foundation with its careful disbursements. I mean the whole shape of it, the thing underneath the thing. I think it was this. We were not trying to be feared. Fear is what you aim for when what you have is power and nothing else. We were not trying to be admired either, because admiration is about how you look, and we had never been particularly concerned with how we looked. What we were trying to do, what we had always been trying to do, since the first person built the first fire and pushed back the dark around the edges of it, was make a guarantee. A guarantee that says, if you are in trouble and you send a signal and we can hear it, we are coming. That is the whole thing. That is the entire substance of it. It applies to a 7-year-old named Fen with a scratch on her forehead and a beacon she pressed in the dark. It applies to a Vareth civilian vessel drifting 2 light hours out with an engine failure, and 3 people aboard who had no particular reason to expect that a human frontier station would bother to answer. It applies to everyone. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the largest thing I know. Not the fleet or the array or the 30 years of preparation, though all of those matter. The largest thing is the decision underneath all of them. That the signal gets answered. That no one drifts in the dark if we can help it. That the beacon means something, every time, to whoever sends it. I docked with the Vareth vessel, and I got the 3 occupants aboard my shuttle, and I gave them water, and I checked them for injuries, of which there were minor ones, and I wrapped the one who was shivering in a thermal blanket, which is a universal comfort regardless of species, and I flew them back to Kepler 7 and called for the engineering team to go deal with their ship. One of the 3, a middle-aged Vareth woman who was clearly the most composed of the group, sat across from me in the shuttle during the flight back and looked at me with the kind of sustained attention that means someone is trying to understand something that does not fit into a category they already have. Eventually she said, through the translation system, "You did not hesitate." "No. Why?" she asked. It is the same question at its heart. It is always the same question. Why did you come? Why did you answer? Why did you go all that way for 1 child, or for 3 strangers in a broken vessel, or for any of it? I thought about how to say it simply. I said, because you sent a signal, that is how it works. She looked at me for a while. Then she turned and looked out the small observation port, at the stars going past. We did not talk again for the rest of the flight. But when we docked, and she stepped off the shuttle onto the Kepler 7 deck and turned back, she put a hand briefly to her chest, which the translation system could not render but which I recognized as a Varath formal gesture of acknowledgement, the kind used for things that cannot quite be covered by words. I nodded. She went with the medical team. I went to the communications room, logged the rescue, updated the incident report, and made myself a drink from the machine that should not have worked but did, because it always did if you knew the right side to hit. I sat in the quiet of the watchroom, and I looked at the scanner and I thought about Fen, growing up to be a navigator, and about the gap in her smile where the tooth was coming back in, and about the drawing of the spaceship with 1 extra wing. Someone asked me, months later, in an interview that was published as part of the official historical record of the campaign, whether Earth was a frightening place. I said, no. Earth is a very kind place. You simply do not want to make it angry, and if you do, you had better hope that it is only angry once, because after that it stops being angry. It becomes something else. It becomes resolved. And resolved, I told them, is so much worse than angry. Angry runs out. Resolve does not. The scanner hummed. The stars held still. Somewhere out in that quiet sector, a small ship was being repaired. Somewhere on Station RS4, a girl with a gap-toothed smile was studying navigation charts and arguing about the names of moons. I drank my coffee. I kept watch. That was the job. It was enough.